So, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you who are on the East Coast. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Education, Law, and Society in partnership with the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. My name is Stacy Seward, and I am a current doctoral candidate in psychology from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and I will be serving as your moderator for this panel discussion today. I am so excited to be here with you. We're here today to engage in a timely but critical conversation about state takeovers of public schools with a particular focus on and attention on what's happening in the takeover of the Houston Independent School District. We would like to use our time today to explore state intervention, what it means for schools to be underperforming, strategies for improvement, and raise questions about political power, community autonomy, racial justice, and the long-term well-being of the students learning in takeover districts. Our panel of esteemed colleagues brings expertise from diverse perspectives that will help us unpack the many dimensions of state takeovers. And today, we hope to explore political agendas, limitations of standardized testing, benefits of standardized testing, immediate long-term consequences, and some of the foreshadowed federal shifts in education policy that might be coming. I am delighted to introduce our panelists who bring a wealth of experience, research, advocacy, and knowledge to this conversation. I'm just going to introduce folks by who I see first on the screen. So I'd like to first introduce Dr. Stephen Nelson. Dr. Nelson is an associate professor and department chair of the Education, Policy, and Leadership in the Educational Psychology, Leadership, and Higher Education Department at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He has taught and led in charter schools, traditional public schools, and private schools in the New Orleans area. Dr. Nelson also served as the first ever education advocate at the Southern Poverty Law Center's School to Prison Pipeline Project in New Orleans. In addition, he worked on charter school law and policy, special education access and equity, and juvenile justice issues. I see next on my screen Dr. Domingo Morel. Dr. Morel is an associate professor at NYU's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service and holds a joint appointment in NYU's Wilk Family Department of Politics. His research focuses on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, education politics, and public policy. He is the author of Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, and Developing Scholars, Race, Politics, and the Pursuit of Higher Education. Next on my screen, I see Beth Schuler. Dr. Beth Schuler is an associate professor of education and public policy at the University of Virginia. She studies education policy, politics, and inequality with a focus on efforts to improve low-performing K-12 schools and districts. Her work in these areas has been published in journals such as the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, Education Evaluation and Policy Analysis, Education Finance and Policy, and Public Opinion Quarterly. And she has been covered by media outlets such as the New York Times, Boston Globe, and Education Week. And finally, I see Dan Dara. Dan is a doctoral candidate in the Education Policy and Planning program at the University of Texas at Austin. His research uses sociological methods to analyze how educators, students, and communities experience and respond to the implementation of accountability policy and other education reforms. His research interests include accountability and policy implementation, school turnaround and takeover, school working conditions, teacher activism, and community-driven school improvement. I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today and for all of your continuing work studying and promoting sound educational policy. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment and set the stage for today's conversation. Our panel brings together a wealth of knowledge and lived experience, with each panelist offering a unique perspective that converge around a shared commitment to equity, justice, and the efficacy of state takeovers. This conversation is an opportunity to explore the complexity of these issues by considering these different lenses and areas of expertise. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights. I want to encourage the audience to engage with us by using the Q&A feature to contribute to this very important dialogue. We'll spend the first part of the webinar in a moderated discussion, followed by an audience-driven Q&A session. We will do our best to incorporate a range of questions to reflect the complexity of the issues we are about to speak. So I want to just kind of dive right in and have our first question. And so to begin, I'd like to explore the politics and power struggles that drive state takeovers. Dr. Morell, can you speak to how state and local politics influence, initiate, and sustain these type of state interventions?
Yeah, thanks, Stacy, for having us and for your question. Really looking forward to being in conversation with my colleagues here and the audience. A couple of things about state takeovers, and Houston, in many ways, kind of fits some of the patterns that we've seen takeovers over time. So, takeover as a policy emerged in the 1980s. State takeovers of local school districts, that is, emerged in the 1980s. And what we saw during that period of time were cities like, in New Jersey, cities like Jersey City, Newark, and then eventually places like Detroit, New Orleans experienced these types of takeovers. What we know is associated with takeover is that in order for a state to take over a local school district, they first need to have a law that allows for that to happen. And these laws are primarily led by Republican governors, and Republican-led state legislatures. And the takeovers are mostly happening in cities with predominantly communities of color, majority African American, mostly majority African American. And this is kind of like the early years of takeovers. Increasingly, these takeovers are happening in places with larger Latino populations as well, like Houston. So that's one of the things that are pretty consistent across the board, usually led a very partisanship dynamic associated with takeovers of majority communities of color. The other part, too, is that is really interesting is that, takeovers, people say that takeovers are about improving school districts. But, if takeovers only happened over school districts that are struggling, we would have a lot more takeovers, right? So we have something like 12,000 school districts in this country, and not that many takeovers, right? And so, what are the other things that are associated with takeovers that are not just schools that are struggling academically or financially? Well, we know that levels of political empowerment among communities of color, particularly Black communities, are associated with takeovers. So the more political power that a Black community has, the more likely they are to be vulnerable to a state takeover. And I think Houston fits within these patterns in some ways, and in some ways it might be marking a kind of new day in state takeovers. So, the partisan dynamics are certainly there in Houston, right, where you have a Republican-led state legislature and governor over this majority Democratic people of color city. So that is consistent with what we know. What is not consistent with the Houston takeover is that takeovers in the 1990s and early 2000s, states really went out of their way to demonstrate that school systems, the whole district was in some way struggling, whether it was academically or financially. Houston, that case is not, you can't make that case, right? By Texas's own metrics, the school district is actually doing pretty well, was doing pretty well at the time of the takeover. And so in one of the, the largest school district in the state of Texas, they pointed to one public school district. In the school district with over 200 schools, they pointed to one school that was deemed underperforming over a number of years and used that as the justification for the takeover. And so in this way, Houston starts to look a little bit different than the other schools, other school districts that have experienced takeovers, because it's not a system-wide issue. It's focused on one school. And we can talk about, and certainly we'll talk about, what that means when a state takes over the school district based on one school, and what that means for that school district and for that city. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I actually think that's a great segue into having a conversation. Like, what does that mean, right? When you see a school district being taken over based on one school versus what has traditionally happened in other schools. I would love for the other panelists to kind of like weigh in on that.
Yeah, thanks Domingo for framing that in the like broad uh this broad framing of what we know about takeovers historically. I think takeover in Houston ISD, I think, is the direct result of policy changes that occurred at the state level around 2015. So Texas has had, right, like a takeover law, an academic bankruptcy law in its Texas education code since 1984. But in 2015, there were a couple of policy changes at the state level that set up the accountability system to initiate this type of takeover that was grounded on the justification of one consistently underperforming school. So in 2015, the state legislature established an A through F rating system that assigned letter grade performance ratings to every campus and district in the state. In the same year, the legislature approved a law that expanded the commissioner's authority to initiate a takeover if a single school within a school district demonstrated 5 consecutive years of unacceptable academic performance. So as a result of that law, right, 2015, 4 years later, 2019 is when the state determined that Wheatley High School, that single campus in Houston ISD, had demonstrated 5 years of academic underperformance. It was, within almost an immediate 5 year window of that law's passage. And so the nature of that policy, I think, sort of sets up the style of takeover that we're seeing in Houston, right? And I think you're right in pointing out that while this takeover is system wide, it's only justified based on the performance of one campus. However, I'll also say the interventions and the responses that are now being implemented, the reforms being implemented under the frame of this takeover, are not focused on one campus or even just a few campuses, right? They're in many ways they're system-wide changes. So while the justification for the takeover was focused only on one school and not necessarily on a system, the solutions and interventions being applied very much are system-wide in their focus.
Yeah.
If I can, I'll say I think what ties together both Domingo and Dan's conversation is this idea that there's political partisanship here. And so it makes sense to have system-wide interventions that are based off of just very minimal evidence, right, for the takeover. And when I think about it, I think about the way that in many of these Republican states, they're not just targeting uh, blue cities and blue districts. They're targeting the political stronghold for these blue districts and blue cities. And I wonder out loud very much what this might do to the political structure downstream. And I know we'll get into that later, but I want to put that out there that there is a world in which this is disrupting not only the school district, but also the political structure and political strongholds of these Democratic districts and cities.
So I think that's an important thing to point out. And in some ways, as we kind of lead into our next question, I do wonder, what is the actual metric that is used for these state takeovers? And so that kind of leads into our next question, which really, I want to frame it by saying that the motivations for state takeovers are often expressed by using either standardized test scores or making claims of district-wide failures. I'd like to ask Dr. Schuler, like, what are your thoughts on the measures that districts use to justify these state takeovers? And what are some of the limitations of like using things like test scores to evaluate to be like broad indicators of a district success or even student success?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. Excited to be with you all. So, I come at this from a kind of education policy perspective. I've sort of gotten interested in this topic in part because I'm just broadly interested in how can we kind of increase educational equity in this country. And so, you might think that kind of policy efforts to focus on kind of districts, sort of systems as a whole that that are kind of labeled as lower performing and tend to, as we know, kind of serve disproportionate shares of low-income students and students of color, might be a way to kind of put a dent in that inequality, right? And so takeover could be potentially a mechanism to do that, or that's sort of the kind of theory of action behind takeover. And so, I think it's kind of an empirical and an open question to some extent, like, is takeover a kind of an opportunity to actually improve those outcomes for the students in these systems? So that's part of, I think, why it's important to look at the academic outcomes. I think there's sort of two main reasons that states give for enacting takeovers. One is the kind of financial, like fiscal kind of challenges or mismanagement. And then the other is the kind of academic piece. And sometimes those two go together and sometimes they don't. But in kind of more recent years, in the sort of test-based accountability era, they've been sort of more and more, there've been more and more kind of justifications based on sort of academic performance. That said, so what we find, which I think is consistent with what Dr. Morell finds and others, that, if you sort of look at what predicts whether a district is taken over, kind of test-based outcomes are predictive of whether a district is taken over, but the sort of racial and ethnic composition of the district is also predictive of takeover, even controlling for the academic achievement of the district. So it seems like there is, that those sort of demographic characteristics are kind of playing some role there. And, in terms of like the pros and cons of kind of using test-based metrics, I'll say that, I think there are there are limitations, right, to using test-based measures in part because they're sort of short-term outcomes, and we also care about sort of longer-term success. And they might not measure everything that we care about schools sort of promoting when it comes to students' kind of holistic well-being. And you worry a little bit about trade-offs or unintended consequences when you're sort of trying to improve test-based outcomes, that could have trade-offs with other important outcomes. That said, I think, I would be careful about sort of writing test-based outcomes off entirely, because I do think there's some compelling kind of research-based evidence that suggests that they are helpful sort of predictors of, long-term life improvements. And one of the challenges of using long-term outcomes is like it takes a long time to observe those outcomes, right? And so it can be useful to look at test-based outcomes, to what extent can students do basic math and read in this context, right? And so, just as a kind of quick summary of some of the work that we have done looking at sort of nationally the impact of state takeovers on student academic outcomes. What we find is basically sort of no impact on math and reading test scores, kind of on average nationally overall. Some evidence of kind of a disruption, so negative impacts in the early years of reforms on reading outcomes in particular. But sort of on average, kind of null effects. But that sort of masks the fact that we also see like a lot of variation across districts in the impacts of takeover. So in some places, it seems to have no effect. In other places, it seems to have really led the way for major improvements in student test-based outcomes. And in other places still, it seems to be quite harmful to test-based achievement. So a lot of interesting variation to unpack, and we could talk a little bit more about that, but connecting it to the Houston context, I think one thing that, Dr. Morell already mentioned is the sort of the way in which the district was not the very lowest performing district in the state, or, even among the very lowest performing districts in the country. One thing we find is that the effect of takeover historically has been the most negative in the relatively higher performing districts and the most positive in the relatively lowest performing districts, right? So I think one implication is states you want to be really cautious about enacting takeovers in contexts where you're not talking about the very, very lowest performing kind of districts in the state or in the country. So anyway, happy to come back to a lot of those themes, but hopefully that gets us started.
Yeah, thank you for that. That would be great. I'm wondering how the remaining panelists feel or think about what Beth has just said about some of maybe the inconsistent outcomes that are tied to these takeovers.
Yeah, so I just want to add a couple of things to that, just to in support of what Dr. Schuler was saying. So while her and her colleagues have found that, as she was saying, there's these no findings, like, they're not improving, certainly not the way that states justify. And this is over a 30-year period of state takeovers, right? That's one way to think about the outcomes. And it's the outcome that most people are concerned with, of course. If you take over a school district because they're not doing well, with either financially or academically, does it lead to improvement? And that's that's an important question, an empirical question to consider. But the other outcome that we need to think about here is because schools are political. They serve as a foundation for communities, particularly in this case communities of color. So what are the political outcomes? And it's quite devastating, right? So schools, communities lose their ability to elect their school board members. They lose their ability to influence school policies, everything from hiring teachers, superintendents, curriculum, all these kinds of things. They lose the ability to do that, which is the same thing that's happening in Houston. So that's one of the outcomes that we really need to think about as well. The other part that I think is really important is in terms of finances. In my research, I show that, takeover laws are more likely to be passed when communities actually win lawsuits to get more resources from their states for their low resource school districts. So that increases the likelihood that a state is going to take over a school. So the narrative that these communities somehow are not, meeting their obligation of improving schools or, educating their children is contradicted by this reality that in the 1980s and 1990s, communities were fighting for more resources to improve their schools, and it is precisely at this time that it increased the likelihood that their schools will be taken over. So that's a financial part of this that we need to think about as well, because when you take over the school district, then you take over those finances as well, right? So that's something for us to think about too.
You know, I'll hop in also around some metrics that I think we should be watching. In the context of New Orleans, we saw a resegregation of schools following the state takeover. In fact, we saw that while the number of total white students in a district expanded, those 80% of those white students ended up in 8 different schools out of roughly 100. And the only thing that really happened qualitatively was that there was no Black high performing option for high schools. We saw that option disappear. The other thing is my early work looking at Memphis, New Orleans, Detroit found that these takeovers actually increased access to the school to prison pipeline, if you can say it that way, and that we saw more disparate discipline outcomes happening in those contexts. And it shows in some of the research I'm doing currently. In Lawrence, I tried to get school-based arrest data and literally got the runaround. The police told me they don't collect data on school-based arrests, which I don't believe. And the district told me that I should talk to the police. So that made it very difficult. And I know for a fact that in Memphis, in the takeover, they were lying about school-based arrests. And for no other reason, they said there were no school-based arrests. And my personal son was arrested on campus. And the language I got around that was, we don't count people who were arrested for good cause. And I'm like, well, I mean, shouldn't all people who get arrested be getting arrested for good cause? I think those are some things we need to watch out for in the Houston context. It's too early to see where that data falls, but I think it's something we should be watching out for.
Yeah, one other thing that I'll add as well, and thank you for both those perspectives, Stephen Domingo. One thing, Beth, that you mentioned was that, measures of student test performance do represent to some degree valuable indicators about students, future opportunity. And I think that that's true. I think what's necessary to temper that with is the recognition that over focus on achieving those performance outcomes can come at the detriment of so many other things. And we should be clear, right? Like, schools serve so many other purposes than functioning just as factories for producing test scores. And I think that we can see this borne out in what's happening in Houston under the takeover, where there really is this hyper focus on improving test scores, which, I mean, I think that that's the state appointed administration there would be open to acknowledging that that is the focus, right? To improve test scores because those test scores matter. I think the problem is that when that's the sole measure of success, then anything that's not measured by the test becomes irrelevant or in many ways is perceived as an obstacle to achieving those higher scores. And so you've seen these pretty dramatic practices being implemented at HISD schools under the takeover model, including the elimination of elective programs, the closure of school libraries. Teachers are explicitly prohibited from reading whole books with students. In the instructional model involves students just completing packets that closely resemble the state standardized test. And so you might see some increase in test scores as a result of that hyper focus, but you're not measuring with a comparable assessment system what's being lost as a result of the trade-offs and pernicious consequences of that overfocus. I'll also say we should be clear, right? Not every subject is tested every year. And because of that, students can be selectively enrolled in tested courses to produce different pools of test takers, which can change the perception of outcomes. And I'll just give you just one example. So in Texas, typically ninth grade students take biology as ninth graders, and students at the end of the year would take a biology end of course exam. That's part of the state of Texas assessment of academic readiness. If you compare year-over-year participation in biology in Houston ISD from the year before takeover to the first year under takeover, enrollments in ninth grade biology at schools identified for turnaround reforms declined by 75%. So of the students who had previously been enrolled in biology as a ninth grader, 3 out of 4 of them were not taking biology. They were taking a remedial science course as ninth graders. And so when you see a year-over-year improvement in scores from the year before takeover to the year following takeover, it's important to recognize you're comparing apples to oranges here. And I think that statement can't be made for every subject and every grade level, but I think we should be clear that, right, like test scores across years are not consistent when the pools of students change. And one other point that I'll add here, as long as we're on the topic of the validity of test-based measures of student performance, the state of Texas has been prohibited from releasing state accountability ratings for campuses and districts for the previous 2 years because over 100 school districts sued the state claiming that those measures were invalid. And so, at an official statewide level, we don't actually know how schools are performing, how districts are performing. I mean, districts have put together their own calculations, but I think that the challenges and to the state accountability system show that those measures might not be as valid as people claim them to be.
Thank you for that, Daniel. And I really appreciate the complexity of this question around assessment. And I think, some of what all of you have said really leads us into our next kind of question around, what does this really mean for communities, right? So we've begun to discuss the ways takeovers impact students, parents, families, but how do these takeovers impact communities longer term? And Daniel, you started to kind of talk about this, but I wonder, Dr. Nelson, if you could maybe speak to this a little bit too, around some of what you have seen in terms of the short and long-term impacts of takeovers, both on students, but also on communities.
Yeah, so I'll start with communities because I think there's a broader impact that trickles down to students. And some of the things I have discovered in my research and I am watching closely in the Houston context, as well as cautiously watching the Memphis context, which is not mentioned so far here, but certainly something that is coming up is the downstream political impacts. One of the things I've realized in at least 3 of the cities that I've studied was that the disruption to school board elections, so once these takeovers occur, there are different ways to occur, but usually in predominantly Black cities, they dismantle the school board. Or sites or put the school board to the side, disempowering it. And then what you start seeing is this really strange trickle-down effect in that you have less people running for school board, but school boards are an important part of our electoral process, particularly for Black and brown people who often get their starts in school board elections. I always joke that school boards are very small. It costs about $5,000 to on average at the national level to run for school board. The districts are pretty small. This is how your cousin who failed biology 3 times ends up as school board president, right? So you see the downstream impact, not just in school boards, but then people are not running for subsequent offices, or there's not a plethora of people running for subsequent offices. We're seeing that real time happen in the Lawrence context. And we've seen it historically in both New Orleans, which is recovering, and to some extent you saw it in certain districts in Memphis under the ASD, which was a smaller subset of takeovers. The other thing is there's a foreclosure of places for advocacy, not just in terms of people being elected, but like where do people go to get reprieve from the policies that these state takeovers implement? There's no place to go. Interestingly enough, if you go to your elected school board members, they have no power. But if you go to the actual state, they'll tell you go to the district, but isn't the state the district in that context? The other thing is, and I think a couple of people have brought this up, there's no political accountability. One of the things in the upcoming paper that will come out in April I look at is whether or not state takeovers are a form of domestic political regime change. Are we switching from democratic structures to autocratic structures? Are we having states sack predominantly Black and brown cities to implement new government structures? And I find yes, but there's a little bit more to it. The last thing I'll say, and this is the impact that I think it has that'll trickle down to students most, is that there's an inability to imagine what good schools look like when you're in state takeover, and thus we don't ever develop these strong schools for students, partially because we spend so much time fighting against state takeover that we forget to think about what happens when we get our schools back. It was an interesting scenario in my hometown in New Orleans when we finally got our schools back. There was almost people were a little bit stunned to find like that we hadn't had a fully functioning school board for a while that had to run an entire school district. My fear that's happening in Lawrence, it will be the same thing when Lawrence gets its schools back. What will the structure be like if we don't already have people who are trained to run school boards? And I wonder in the Houston context, given that I think, if I'm correct, that either Houston Independent School District's board has been set aside or dismantled altogether, what will happen when the district gets its schools back? When it comes to students in particular, the data I worry about most, and this is getting back to Dr. Schuler's commentary around test scores and also bridging back to, because we know those test scores do actually matter if students can read on level. If they cannot read on level, there are places where they send those people. So those people who can't read on level, and that trickles down to the criminal justice system. But I think the other thing is thinking about what does that mean for disparate discipline. I'll wrap up there. I know I have more to say, but we can get to that in the question and answer. I know some of my colleagues want to join in.
Yeah, I'd love to hop in. Just, I mean, it's a comment that's, I think, related to the last theme as well as this one, which is just around this, this topic of kind of test-based measures and kind of test-based accountability more generally. I think I do want to, flag this because I think we're at a really important moment as a country where at the federal level, right, there are dramatic actions being taken to basically get rid of and dismantle the sort of measures that we, which are, largely kind of test-based measures that we can use to kind of track basic math and reading skills. And, that I think leads creates the possibility that we have a really limited way to kind of limited mechanisms for sort of documenting and understanding inequality and for holding elected officials accountable and holding school systems that have not necessarily traditionally or historically served students of color and low-income students very well accountable. And so I think I want to be just real about the fact that, I think the alternative that's, to sort of the test-based accountability we've had in the past and the future is not a sort of more holistic measure of student flourishing and well-being. It's like a lack of data on, how students are doing on basic skills. And so I think like it's important to sort of recognize that. I think my read of the evidence might be a little bit on sort of test-based accountability more generally. Might be a little bit more optimistic. Than others, just in the sense that, I think there's limited evidence that looks at the sort of long-term outcomes of these policies, right? Because again, you have to look longer term, it's hard to do. But there's some interesting work, not on takeovers, but on sort of the pre-No Child Left Behind school accountability system in the state of Texas, where what the authors are trying to do is basically reconcile these two literatures, where we see a literature that shows test-based accountability improves short-term test scores, but then we also see, as you're describing, Dan, like documentation about sort of gaming behaviors, unintended consequences, curriculum narrowing, all of those things, right? And so what do we make of that? Like, is on balance, are these policies good or bad for kids in the long run, right? And so these authors, this is a study by Dave Deming and Jen Jennings, Sarah Cahotis, Sandy Jenks, so sort of economists and sociologists getting together to try to understand this. And what they find is, if you look at kids who were in schools that were under accountability pressure in Texas in the pre-No Child Left Behind era, and you look at their long-term outcomes, so things like earnings, employment outcomes, likelihood of incarceration, like things that I think we can all get on board with, like are sort of like important, they find that accountability pressure had a positive impact for kids that were in the very lowest performing schools on their very long-term outcomes. Now, it actually had a negative impact on the kids that were in the sort of more average schools that were trying to get the like recognized rating. And the way that that the sort of mechanism through which that operated was through what you're describing of strategic reclassifications of students into special education services to try to sort of change the testing pool to kind of make your school get the gold star and look better and get a kind of recognized rating. So I just want to, just kind of get on the table. I think some of the best available evidence we have does suggest that despite some of those unintended consequences and gaming behaviors that are known and documented, I think if you have a well-designed system, which is a big open question, and you're monitoring these other important outcomes like you're talking about with sort of, arrests and disciplinary outcomes and attendance and other measures that we might care about, I think there's a potential with good policy design to sort of do accountability in a way that has more of a positive impact on student long-term well-being.
Yeah, I'll also add, Stephen, you said something that I think was really important. I really look forward to reading that paper when it comes out. That Takeover, in a way, is an attempt at political regime change. And I think viewed in that light, when we think about other instances or other frames through which governments try to initiate regime change, right? We could think about takeovers, as I do in some of my research, in comparison to, like, for example, a military occupation, where the goal of regime change is the transformation not just of governance structures, but also of institutions and of culture. And I think, thinking about the impact that the regime change in Houston is having on schools and as institutions and on the culture within schools, I think it's really important to highlight the impact that it's having on teachers and school leaders in addition to community members. So, in the first year of Takeover, about 40% of the district's teaching force left voluntarily or were terminated, 40%. Almost 60% of principals turned over in the first year. And so, there's a lot of ways to spin that information, right? There's folks who would argue that, there's a need to replace teachers with higher performers. But when you look at who the district is hiring to replace these teachers, right, we're in a statewide teacher shortage in Texas. 1 in 5 teachers at the start of the current school year in Houston lacked certification. So these are, veteran, experienced teachers with institutional knowledge, principals, many of them award-winning principals of the year, highly respected and beloved by their communities, that are leaving the district, that are being pushed out. And so I think if your argument is that you need to engage this mass staff replacement to increase quality, you would expect to see the highest performing principals and teachers, the ones with the most institutional knowledge, being engaged and remaining. And in fact, what we're seeing is those, in many cases, are the teachers and principals who are leaving. And I think when we look at the culture that's changed, that's changing, I've talked to a lot of teachers and principals in Houston, and overwhelmingly what I hear is the description of what they call a culture of fear, of disrespect. And many teachers who describe the instructional model that they're asked to implement as educational malpractice that's harmful to students. And so, we can look at the eventual outcomes, right? How do students perform on the test? But I think when you're losing so many teachers and so many principals, you're seeing this dramatic change in the culture across schools. I think when we get to the point where the district returns to local control, sure, the school board, right, you might be able to elect new leaders to lead, but you're going to have a completely different instructional educational workforce within the schools to operate with. The institutional knowledge that exists within the schools is going to be completely different. So I think when we think about regime change, we should think not just about those governance systems and structures, but also about institutions and also about the culture within the schools.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And so from what I'm hearing, it seems like there's a gap between the actual theory around what good policy might be and the actual application about what might actually happen on the ground. And so, Dan, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what is happening in Houston, both in the response to the takeover, and actually how this takeover was even framed in the beginning. How did Houston get here? So it'd be great to kind of hear you kind of infuse some of what you were just speaking about, and then maybe take us on a little bit of a journey about how we even got here in the first place.
Sure. And I think, anybody who's in Houston right now, I know many of them are in this meeting right now. I think when people ask, what's going on with this takeover, I think for many folks, the first thing that comes to mind is just the starkness of the division that exists on the one hand between the state and state appointed leaders and the community broadly. And the nature of that division has existed from the beginning of the takeover. And I think some would even argue it's right a division that, as Domingo hinted at in the first question, right? This is a political division. This is a racialized division between the state and the city that goes back decades. And so when we look at that division that's emerged in Houston, I would interpret it as broadly like a punitive or a disciplinary dynamic where the state officials and state appointed leaders see their role as disciplining a rogue school district that for too long tolerated academic failure. Community members who are then on the receiving end, teachers on the receiving end, students on the receiving end, families on the receiving end of that disciplinary dynamic, see the states actually as responsible for for selectively abandoning their community. And this is something that's happened right over decades of austerity measures from the state in terms of how the state funds public education. Texas consistently ranks in the lowest 10 states for public education funding, and then coupled with raising expectations. So at the same time that the state has not increased public education funding, they have dramatically ramped up accountability expectations. So the state wants higher performance, but they don't want to pay more for it. And so when you look at how that dynamic is playing out on the ground, I think it's clear, we should be clear, right? This takeover is a long process. The state initially attempted to take over in 2019 after Wheatley's academic performance reached those 5 consecutive years of unacceptable performance. But because of a lawsuit and an injunction that was filed, for 4 years, the takeover remained in legal limbo until the state eventually was able to succeed when the state Supreme Court overruled that injunction. They did so by interpreting legislation that was passed during that interim period in which the state determined that the commissioner's accountability determinations for sanctions were final and unappealable. So as a result, the state Supreme Court justice who interpreted that law then retroactively applied provisions of that 2021 law to abrogate the claims of plaintiffs who had sued to stop the takeover. Now, so since the takeover has begun, right, I think that, this question's about what resistance, what organizing looks like on the ground. I think it's very difficult to be able to say, across the entire community of, 2.3 million Houstonians, like, how does the community feel about the takeover? But I'll say in terms of the folks who are engaged in what's happening, who are paying attention, who are showing up, there's a very real sense of this division between the state and between the community. And so, we've seen historically across takeovers that typically when there is organized resistance, it typically comes from some sort of strategic alliance between teachers' unions and grassroots organizations. And Texas is a pretty unique context to talk about teachers' unions, right? It's one of only 7 states where public school educators are barred from collective bargaining. There are extremely high penalties in Texas for any teachers who engage in a strike or a work stoppage. They can lose their certification. They can be forced to forfeit their pensions. And so while there are teachers' unions on the ground in Houston that are organizing responses, they're very constrained in what they're able to do, right? When you think about right, in comparison, for example, to teachers union in Chicago, right? CTU organized a strike to protest the mayoral control model implemented under state takeover. A strike in Houston comes with much more risk for teachers. And so Houston Federation of Teachers, for example, which is the largest employee union in Houston ISD, they've relied primarily, I would say, on like a legal and grievance-based approach. So there's been, to step back, a huge increase in grievances filed overall in the district. So before the takeover in a typical year, there were, I think, typically you'd see between 150 and 200 grievances filed. In the first year of takeover, there were over 400 grievances filed. So like more than doubling. And so the union has also filed a lot of lawsuits to contest different proposals, some successfully. For example, policies that would restrict teachers' social media use, being able to help post things that are critical of the district. That was initially proposed until a lawsuit filed by the union stopped it. There are policies that the district has implemented restricting students' restroom access that require classroom doors to remain open at all times, right? And the union has been engaged in legal and grievance-based approaches to contesting that. I'll say, though, where we've seen the most powerful organizing happening in Houston, it's been at the grassroots level of the community. And really, I have to highlight the work that's been done by Community Voices for Public Education, which is a multiracial, community-based group that has advocated for strong and equitable public schools in Houston and across the state of Texas for over 14 years. And so much of what's happening on the ground in Houston can be traced back to CVP's strategies, not just for resisting the takeover, but for advocating for those strong and equitable public schools that, I think all people would agree we want, that the vision of what that looks like is different. And so CVP has been involved in so many different activities, from organizing protests, read-ins, student walkouts, teacher sickouts, consistent board testimony, lobbying state officials, engaging the media. And I think really what's made their organizing approach effective is their intentional development of organic leaders from within the community. So since the takeover, there's been this huge influx of people who all of a sudden are activated and want to be able to do something, to speak up in defense of their children's schools or as teachers for their own workplaces. And so CVP has been really effective at incorporating these teachers and these parents and developing them as organic leaders by training them with institutional know-how to know how to navigate district systems, and through coaching to help them develop the skills to be effective organizers. And I think also where CVP's played a really important role, and this is something that we've seen across other takeovers, is building sort of like a collective identity across teachers, parents, and other folks across the district to try to get this sense that we're all in this together, right? That brings together educators and community members towards a common struggle. And this is something that we've seen, right? In some takeovers where resistance movements have been effective at restoring districts to local control, it's happened because of these multi-institutional coalitions that bring together educators and community members in a common cause. Where takeovers haven't ended, where they haven't proceeded, is where there's been divisions between teachers' unions and community members, or where those groups never came together to figure out their shared interests. So I'll pause there. I'll let other folks talk, but I think, I think it's important to recognize that without CVP, without this organized resistance movement on the ground, I think this takeover would look very different at this point than it does at the moment.
I just want to thanks for that, Daniel. That's a really great insight into what's happening in Houston for all of us to learn about. Stacy, I just want to just add something to a comment that you made earlier, real briefly. So when you said that there seems to be a gap between theory and practice, I want to suggest that there's a gap between the justification for the takeovers and the practice. The theory, I think there is no gap. The theory is we're going to disempower communities, right? That's the intent. And so if we think about it that way, I mean, I think we have evidence from all of our research, from the outcomes research that Beth has engaged in, Stephen, and now Daniel, and the work that I've done, that it's really hard to make a compelling case that state takeovers are about improving educational outcomes for these schools. It's really hard, really hard. So if we dig in a little bit deeper, there the idea that there is a gap between what the intentions are and what's actually happening, I think really falls apart. I think what the intentions are actually being fulfilled in many, many ways. The disempowerment of communities of color. Just wanted to add that.
And if I could hop in, uh, I don't think I'm the only person on the panel who grew up in a district that was subsequently taken over. But I want to just speak outside of my research side to just the element of having grown up in New Orleans public schools. One of the things I've wrestled with mostly with that is the idea that I went to the magnet school system in New Orleans, so I was able to benefit from increased resources and other people were not. And so I remember one of the things for my siblings who did not go to those schools, when we would discuss the state takeover, they had a completely different perspective than me. And their argument was chiefly, you had all of these advantages we did, and now at the bare minimum, we can try something. And I think it's important to note in context that these districts were usually in trouble well before the takeover, but I think it's important to contextualize it. Now that we're talking about theory, CRT would instruct us to think about this in a historical context, and that these districts ended up in trouble, not because of their own doing, but mostly because of divestment from the state. And I think it's important, though, that we highlight that the experience that some people are desperate for, because one of the things in my research I often find is communities will get duped into this almost because they're promised more resources. And who doesn't want more resources for their schools, except for the moment that you bite the bait, you're kind of stuck in takeover. One of the things I'm happy about to see is that the folk in Houston seem to be resisting this pretty strongly. And I think the people in Memphis, who I think is next up on the list, are also resisting this pretty strongly, not taking the bait.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that clarification around, theory, right? So, this conversation has been so robust. I want to make sure that there is time for our audience questions. And so we have a number of questions. And so hopefully we can continue this dialogue as we're going through the questions. I want to start with a question from Tequila, and it reads, I'm in Memphis, Tennessee, and we are fighting against the state takeover. They are attempting to model it after the Houston model. Are there any suggestions or tips you can share to help us strengthen our efforts to stop it?
Well, I think Daniel right now has some thoughts based on. I have some thoughts too, but I think Daniel, you're. But one of the things I would say that is really important, and I think we've seen it based on what Daniel's saying, we've seen it in Houston and we saw it in other places. I think it's really important for the folks in Memphis to organize across the sectors, as Daniel was saying, right? From the teachers to, although it is very difficult in Tennessee to get union organizing, we know that, very much like in Texas, right? But, the different groups, sectors across the board. But equally as important, I think, Memphis folk need to get together with Nashville folk, with other cities, because they are all under attack, right? And so one of the things that I learned, like in New Jersey, for instance, and in Michigan, that it took organizing with folks in Newark and Jersey City and Patterson to try to push against the takeover, because these cities were all under attack by these state interventions. And so I think it's really important to, within Memphis, to organize, but then the folks in Memphis seek their other colleagues and groups, organizations in other cities in Tennessee, because they are also under attack as well, democratically. So that's one thought that I have based on my research that I think may be helpful in the Memphis context.
Yeah, thanks for this question. It's super important. I've been paying attention to what's happening at the state level in Memphis because lawmakers are saying they want to model their takeover law off of Texas's to reproduce the outcomes in Houston. We should be clear, right, that the state takeover in Houston was originally designed and carried out with the intention of serving as a model case for to serve as a symbolic model for other districts in Texas to adopt, but also for districts across the country. So this model that's being implemented in Houston, this reform model, it's being set up as a showcase, an attempt to showcase a model to take on the road. So I would say, first, a large part of the response that's happened on the ground in Houston has been a process of political education. So people need to know what's going on. They're going to need to know to remain informed as changes roll out so quickly that it's very hard to keep up with them. I think it's important for folks like you, Tequila, or other folks who are aware of that this takeover is on the horizon to start gathering information and evidence, preparing resources now to be able to educate folks when they're ready to become engaged. And I think in Houston, that's one area that CVP and other organizations have been really effective is when people come to them and say, what's going on? How can I get engaged? Those resources to educate people about what's happening, how we got here, and what to do next already exist. There are ways to plug in. I think also, as I saw in the chat from Melissa, right, there's a need to build these coalitions, not just across educators and community members, but across districts that are facing these policies. And I think there's a lot that folks in Memphis can learn from the folks who are in Houston right now who are doing this work. And so I would strongly encourage reaching out to Melissa and other folks in Houston who are organizing on the ground.
Stacey, if I can hop on really quickly, I know. Oh, no, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Beth. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Are you sure? All right, I'll be quick. One other thing I would point to is, I mentioned that we see a lot of variation in terms of the effects of takeover on student outcomes. One of the things that, seems to help explain some of that variation in the impacts, I think, is the extent to which there is sort of built-in mechanisms for local input and kind of school level autonomy, mechanisms for sort of teacher voice. And I don't just mean mechanisms for people to sort of just voice their opinion. I mean actual mechanisms as part of the governance structure for local representatives to have a voice on governing bodies at the school level and at the district level. So we have some work looking across districts in Massachusetts, but I think there's sort of persuasive evidence from elsewhere that would kind of point to that. So happy to talk with folks if that's useful to kind of look at particular cases where, if you can kind of make the case that the success of, okay, maybe we want the state to be helpful in improving this district, but there's an important role that sort of that locals need to play in this process if we want this to be an effective effort.
Okay, very quickly, two things. Big ups to everything everybody else is saying. I'm on board fully, but the other thing I'll say is, remember, law will not save us in this context. But what law can do is slow down the system. So feel free to file these lawsuits to get these preliminary injunctions while giving yourself time to get the politics and policies around to support yourselves. The last thing, special shout out to Beth for bringing up what is essentially this idea that we've known since the 80s, at least, that descriptive representation gets substantive representation in academic outcomes in terms of schools. Leverage that to get at as much input as you can into the politics and policies, or specifically the policies of education in the Houston area.
Yep. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. So we have a few other questions that I want to see if we can maybe get to. Jeremy said that from Houston, we are here feeling like we should be getting more national coverage with the terrible things that are happening here. How can we get more attention on what is happening to us?
I mean, one of the things that I think Houston can do with others with other cities is try to think about reaching out to national organizations like the NAACP, for instance, and the Legal Defense Fund, who have been doing work on this on different fronts. The issue, the concern, or the major issue is that folks in Houston are experiencing this and rightfully so think that this is just happening in Houston. Folks in Memphis that are going through this right now are thinking this is just happening in Memphis. Folks in Providence, and so forth. And the reality is that essentially every city in America that has people of color has or is experiencing this to some degree, right? And so the extent that we can try to reach out to national organizations that can bring people together across cities and across states to then highlight what is happening here. And one of the things that hasn't happened, and regretfully, Houston lost a great representative, Sheila Jackson Lee, not too long ago, and she was at the forefront of this, right? And so, I remember being part of a conversation before the takeover happened, where she was part of these conversations. And so, I think that one of the things that we need to do is to try to incorporate Congress into this as well. Is people think that this is just a state issue. No, it's a national issue. And so I think to the degree that we could get national leaders through Congress and other avenues part of this conversation, as well as national organizations, I think that's a way to bring attention to what's happening in Houston, Memphis, and other places.
This is probably on the outskirts of what you're asking, but one of the things that I tell people, and I met some folks in Lawrence do this, is work with scholars who are doing community-based participatory action research. We're here to actually help tell your story and give you the data that you need to push back against some of this stuff. I think there's twofold. There's the narrative that you have to get out in terms of the politics, but also there's the data you have to back it up. And one of the things that states have been really good at when they take over school districts is, and I say this all the time, they are the player, the coach, the referee, and most importantly, the sportscaster. Because they can spin the story however they want because they have all the data that at their hands, and we typically don't. But if we can develop that data, we can at least push back on some of the narrative.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this question up, Jeremy, because when we look historically at takeovers, in cases where there was an active news media that kept people apprised of what was happening on the ground, communities remained informed. They were able to more successfully win efforts to restore district to local control. Whereas in communities where there was not, an active news media on the ground, when stories were not getting regional or national attention, it was much harder for community members to know on a day-to-day basis of what's going on. And I should say, there is a pretty robust news media ecosystem in Houston locally. I think, taking this story nationally, I think requires doing that work of linking, as Domingo and Steven said, what's happening in Houston to what's happening everywhere. And I would say not just in education, right? We're seeing similar types of autocratic policies implemented in other domains. In Texas, this accountability system that's being implemented is happening at the same time as attacks on the voting rights of people of color across the state. Last year, the governor unilaterally revoked the voter registrations of 2 million voters across the state, impacting over 300,000 voters in Houston. And so I think if we are framing this not as a question of school improvements, but as a question of democracy and civil rights, I think we can be more effective at linking what's happening in Houston to these broader political trends that are happening across domains in this country.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we have another question. This question says, I was wondering how you all see the takeover relating to the broader context of how, quote, good school board governance is defined. For instance, Texas uses the Lone Star governance framework, which is an offshoot of the student outcomes focused governance that is a nationwide framework. What are the connections that we see between takeover implementation and other actors in the school reform movement?
Well, happy to jump in. Oh, that's okay. Thanks, Domingo. So, I'll just say that, I do, I don't think I have a great answer to the question of like what is the ideal in terms of school board governance, but I think that is like a big part of the rationale that proponents of takeover make, right? Is that sort of school board governance is kind of limited, and so I do think as a broader community and field, like we need to be sort of thinking about like how can we improve school board governance early because I don't think we have great evidence that there's sort of some alternative silver bullet in a governance arrangement like takeover or mayoral control, but I also don't think that we have great evidence that sort of school boards are kind of operating to our greatest sort of ideals of like what we would kind of hope for in terms of local democratic kind of governance. And so, what do I mean by that? I just am thinking about sort of very, very low rates of participation in school board elections, and electorates that are not typically always representative of the communities that these elected officials go on to serve. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done to kind of to sort of think about how we could improve school board governance more broadly with reforms around kind of electoral policies and a variety of different things. I think it's also for sort of advocates and sort of policymakers who are thinking about these questions around, I think the theory of action of state takeover is based in large part on the premise that the sort of the kind of root of the problem is the school board governance, right? Because that is definitionally how I would think about state takeover, is a shift in sort of decision-making authority from a locally elected school board to back up to the state. And so the theory of action, again, is that something's going wrong with the school board governance piece. But I think it's not always the case that takeovers happen in places where it's clear that that is the root of the problem. And so I think, you want to be thinking about in your relative context, like what are the sort of root causes of the challenges that may be occurring if there are challenges, and, does it, so sort of like trying to understand, does that logic kind of hold in this context? And, if not, what might be other solutions that might be better kind of tailored and suited to your particular context?
And if I could add to that, so I think, Beth is right about the institutions and institutional arrangements that contribute to participation in school board elections. So that's something that I think across the board we need to do much better at. For instance, when are school board elections held? How much money do people need to be raising to participate in school board elections? Do you have district versus at-large elections? So the state of Texas, right, is organizing these at-large elections to be able to have these conservative takeovers of school boards. And so we know from political science literature that when you have at-large elections, it just makes it less likely that you're going to have representation across the, from people of color and poor people and so forth. So those are all things that are important for us to think about. But in regard to the actual governance of schools, one thing that I think we need to make very clear is that democracy and governance are messy. All you have to do is take a look at Congress right now and see, how messy it is. No one is saying that we should get rid of Congress. Well, there might be some people saying that, but I think generally none of us here are saying that there should be an abolishment of Congress. No, democracy is messy and school boards are messy. And so what we see too often is that this governance failure of governance is used as a pretext to then justify all these other interventions, when in reality it's just part of our, in many of these cases, it's just part of our democratic process. You have people who are competing over resources, competing over ideas, and some people do better at this stuff than others. But the idea that we should remove democracy because of ideas that governance is not the way that we want it to be is what we really need to be questioning, right? Which is what happens in these communities of color when they lose their school boards.
So I think thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. And this question is from Isaac. And so Isaac James is from Memphis, Tennessee. And the ask here is, have y'all seen any impact to refugee and immigrant students around performance and resources, such as ESL funding, and I'm assuming with the state takeovers?
I mean, I will say it's not necessarily specific to English learner students, but one of the patterns that we see in the literature on impacts of takeovers is that the effects of takeovers on student outcomes seem to vary depending on the kind of ethnic composition of the district. So we tend to see more negative impacts in communities serving larger concentrations of Black students and more positive effects in communities serving larger concentrations of Hispanic students. Now, that's also true. We see that also in the, like, not just to state takeover, but in the broader kind of like school turnaround, district turnaround, and improvement kind of literature. And I don't think that's particularly well understood, like why that is the case or what's going on there. I think in the case of takeover, like one explanation that I think is consistent with the pattern of results, but you guys should, jump in if you disagree with my characterization of some of your findings, is that, I think Dr. Morell, my understanding is that you tend to see when you're looking at the impacts of takeover on the kind of descriptive representation in communities. Takeover tends to kind of decrease descriptive representation in majority Black communities, but in some cases has kind of paved the way for greater descriptive representation in majority Latino communities. So if I'm getting that right, it feels to me like there's a sort of story around this mechanism of kind of who's in who gains access to political power that seems to kind of explain why we might see more positive effects in some places versus others. I know that doesn't totally get to this person's question about ESL students in particular, but I do think it is kind of a striking and interesting pattern.
And I would add to that, or I guess an add to, in my experience studying state takeovers, roughly a decade of this, I don't think we have one uncontroverted example of of district turnaround. Like every one of them, even when we've seen the data, there's controversy around how we got there. And every time it's always called a miracle, right? It was the New Orleans miracle, and then we found out maybe not so much. It was the Lawrence miracle, and then we found out maybe not so much. And I definitely think there is some improvement that happens, right? But are we talking about massive turn? When I think about turnaround, I'm not thinking 1 or 2% percentage points. I'm thinking, especially if the turnaround means getting rid of political power for residents. Um, I don't know the answer to your question, but I would assume, Isaac, that we're not seeing this massive influx in funding and or achievement by any group of students over time.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly, this is a great question for context of Houston because Houston has a very large immigrant population. I think like 1 in 4 Houstonians are immigrants. And in Houston ISD, what we've seen under the takeover is actually a lot of concerns from educators about the takeover instructional models impeding their ability to provide mandated language services for emergent bilingual students because of this, one-size-fits-all curriculum. It makes it very difficult to individualize instruction. I can't speak specifically to funding in this case, but I know that a lot of teachers who I've talked to have concerns about their ability to support students' language development under the instructional model.
Thank you for that. And with that, we are actually at time. This went by so incredibly quickly. Before we conclude, I want to thank all of you, our panelists. I'd like to thank our audience. I want to thank the Education and Law Society and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for hosting this. I also want to give the panelists the opportunity to put their contact information in the chat. So it seems like we have a couple of other questions that are still out here. There are folks who are asking for the recording. So if you all could just put your contact information in the chat so folks could reach out with any questions or to be able to get the video. And I just once again want to thank all of you for being here and participating in this panel with us.
Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us. Yeah, it's been great.